Sometimes, a single moment of compassion can change your entire life forever. In the unforgiving world of ancient Skallavik, Thora learned this truth the hard way. She was just a servant girl trying to survive when she found a wounded stranger bleeding in the forest. Helping him meant losing her job and facing starvation. But she couldn't walk away from someone in pain. For days, she secretly cared for him, bringing food and medicine while he recovered in silence. When her mistress found out, Thora was thrown out with nothing. She returned to the woods to say goodbye. But the man was gone. The next morning, an army of warriors knelt before her door. The beggar she saved stood before them, tall, powerful, wearing wolf pelts. He was Hrolf the Iron Wolf, the most feared war chief in the north. What would he want with her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the wooden walls of Skallavik, like the breath of sleeping giants. In this remote corner of the northern lands, where pine forests stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, the small settlement had learned to survive through careful order and unwavering discipline. Every soul knew their place, every hand had its purpose, and every rule existed for the protection of all. Thora pulled her thin woolen shawl tighter against the autumn chill as she made her way across the muddy courtyard toward the main hall. At 19, she had spent more than half her life in service to Lady Astrid's household, her days measured in swept floors, hauled water, and tended fires. Her fingers unconsciously touched the simple silver pendant at her throat, the only thing left of her mother, who had died of fever when Thora was barely 8 winters old. The pendant had belonged to her grandmother before that, passed down through generations of women who had little else to leave behind. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Thora would trace its smooth surface and remember her mother's gentle hands, teaching her which herbs eased pain and which ones fought infection. Those lessons, whispered over steaming bowls in their tiny cottage, had proven more valuable than any inheritance of silver or land. Thora, the fire in the great hall has gone cold again. Lady Astrid's sharp voice cut through the morning air like a blade through linen. The woman stood in the doorway of the hall, her greying hair pulled back severely, her pale eyes reflecting the same hardness that had kept her household running efficiently since her husband's death 3 winters past. Yes, my lady. I'll see to it at once. Thora quickened her pace, her wooden shoes splashing through puddles left by the night's rain. She had learned long ago that prompt obedience saved everyone unnecessary grief. Lady Astrid ruled her domain with the same iron discipline her late husband had used to protect their lands from raiders and wolves. The great hall stretched before her, its high wooden beams disappearing into shadows above. Long tables stood ready for the morning meal, their surfaces scarred by years of use. Thora knelt by the massive stone hearth, her practiced hands working to coax new flames from the glowing embers. The familiar routine brought comfort. There was safety in knowing exactly what each day would bring. "The miller's son was asking about you again yesterday," said Kari, the kitchen maid, as she entered carrying an armload of bread loaves. At 15, Kari still possessed the easy laughter that hardship had not yet worn away. "Eric seems quite taken with your quiet ways." Thora smiled softly as she fed kindling to the growing flames. "Eric is a good man. His father runs an honest mill." "That's hardly the response of a maiden whose heart has been captured," Kari teased, setting down her burden. "Most girls would be pleased to catch the attention of the miller's heir. Most girls have more to offer than empty hands and borrowed clothes." Thora stood, brushing ash from her skirts. The brown woolen dress had been Lady Astrid's years ago, altered and mended until it bore little resemblance to its former elegance. Kari's expression grew serious. "You have more to offer than you realize. Your knowledge of healing herbs saved old Henrik when the fever nearly took him. And when little Marta broke her arm, your splinting kept it straight and true. These small acts of kindness were Thora's quiet rebellion against a world that seemed determined to grind everyone down to their most basic survival. Her mother's teachings had given her something precious, the ability to ease suffering. It mattered little that she owned nothing of material value when she could offer comfort to those in pain. Lady Astrid grows more worried about the approaching winter, Kari continued in lower tones. The traders speak of raiders moving south from the Icelands, Vikings with iron ships and weapons forged in dragonfire. Thora had heard these whispers too. Every autumn brought fresh rumors of war bands, seeking easy prey before the snows made travel impossible. The northern seas had spawned generations of warriors who viewed peaceful settlements like Skallavik as storehouses waiting to be emptied. "We've survived other threats," Thora said, though she couldn't quite keep the uncertainty from her voice. "The palisade is strong, and our men know how to fight. Perhaps, but these are said to be led by chieftains whose very names freeze the blood. They speak of one called Hrolf the Iron Wolf, who has never lost a battle, whose berserkers fight like demons possessed." A chill ran down Thora's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had heard that name whispered around evening fires, always accompanied by crossed fingers and muttered prayers. Stories told of burned settlements and populations scattered like leaves before the storm. Wind. "Such talk serves no purpose," she said firmly. "We can only tend to our duties and trust in the protection of our walls." Lady Astrid appeared in the doorway again, her keen eyes scanning the hall for any sign of imperfection. "The stores must be counted again today. With winter approaching, we cannot afford to lose track of a single sack of grain or jar of preserved meat." Thora nodded respectfully. She knew every barrel and basket in the storage cellars, could account for each measure of oil and every bundle of dried herbs. Organization had become second nature during her years of service. Yet lately, she had noticed small discrepancies, missing items that seemed to vanish without explanation. The morning progressed with its familiar rhythm of tasks. Thora swept the sleeping chambers, changed rushes on the floors, and helped prepare the midday meal. Through it all, she found her thoughts drifting to the forest beyond the palisade walls. Soon, she would need to venture out to gather the last autumn herbs before frost killed them. Her stores of healing plants were running low, and winter would bring its share of illness and injury. The forest had always been her sanctuary, a place where the weight of service lifted from her shoulders. Among the ancient trees, she could remember her mother's voice more clearly, could almost hear the old songs that had filled their cottage during happier times. It was there that she felt most connected to the knowledge passed down through generations of women who had survived through wisdom and compassion rather than strength of arm. As the sun reached its peak, Thora found herself standing at the small window of the storage room, gazing toward the tree line. The maples had turned brilliant gold, and the oaks showed the first hints of russet brown. In a few days, she would make her final gathering expedition of the year. Lady Astrid would grant permission reluctantly. She always worried about servants venturing beyond the safety of the settlement, but the necessity of winter preparations would win out over caution. "You have that look again," Kari observed, joining her at the window. "The one you get when you're thinking about the woods." "I'm thinking about yarrow and willow bark," Thora replied. "About chamomile for sleepless nights and elderberry for winter coughs. And about freedom, Kari added quietly. Thora didn't deny it. The forest represented everything her daily life lacked: space to breathe, silence to think, and the illusion that she controlled her own destiny. Among the trees, she was not merely Lady Astrid's servant, but a woman with knowledge and purpose. The afternoon brought news that made everyone uneasy. Traders arriving from the eastern settlements spoke of burned farmsteads and missing livestock. Raiders had struck 3 days' journey away, taking what they pleased and leaving only smoke and sorrow behind. The attacks showed the methodical planning of experienced warriors rather than the desperate hunger of common bandits. "They move like a wolf pack," reported Olaf, the lead trader, as he warmed himself by the evening fire. "Strike fast, take what they need, and vanish before help can arrive. But these wolves are led by someone who knows warfare like a master craftsman knows his tools." Lady Astrid's face had grown pale in the firelight. Her husband had been a capable leader, but he was 3 years dead, and their current defenses relied more on hope than strength. "How many men does this war band number?" The survivors speak of perhaps 50 warriors, though fear may make them exaggerate. What troubles me more is their discipline. These are not wild berserkers drunk on battle rage. They fight with the precision of men who have conquered greater prizes than a few frontier settlements. That night, as Thora banked the fires and secured the hall for sleep, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the forest. Tomorrow, she would ask Lady Astrid for permission to gather herbs. The request would be granted. It always was, but this time felt different. This time, she sensed that her journey into the woods would mark the end of one life and the beginning of something she could not yet imagine. She touched her mother's pendant one last time before settling onto her straw pallet in the servants' quarters. Around her, the other maids whispered their own fears about raiders and winter hardships. But Thora's thoughts had moved beyond worry to a strange sense of anticipation. Change was coming to Skallavik, arriving as surely as the autumn frost. Whether that change would bring destruction or deliverance remained to be seen. The last thing she remembered before sleep was the sound of wind moving through distant trees, calling her toward whatever destiny awaited in the shadows of the ancient forest. The morning fog hung thick between the trees as Thora slipped through the small gate in the palisade wall. Lady Astrid had granted permission for the herb-gathering expedition, though not without stern warnings about staying close to the settlement and returning before the sun reached its peak. The forest paths were treacherous enough without the added danger of raiders prowling the borderlands. Thora carried her mother's old gathering basket, woven from willow branches and worn smooth by countless expeditions. Her knife hung at her belt alongside a small cloth pouch for seeds and roots. The familiar weight of these tools brought comfort, connecting her to generations of women who had walked these same paths in search of nature's remedies. The deeper woods beckoned beyond the usual gathering spots near the settlement's edge. Thora knew she should heed Lady Astrid's warnings and stay close to safety, but the finest healing herbs grew in the old places, where human feet rarely trod and the ancient spirits still held sway. Today felt different somehow, as if the forest itself were calling her toward something momentous. Her breath misted in the cool air as she followed a deer path between towering pines. The trees here were old beyond memory, their massive trunks scarred by lightning and storm, but still reaching toward the sky with patient endurance. Moss carpeted the forest floor in shades of emerald and jade, muffling her footsteps and creating an almost sacred silence. She found the first prize growing beside a fallen log, wild garlic, its pungent bulbs perfect for treating infections and fever. Thora knelt carefully, using her knife to dig around each plant, before lifting it gently from the earth. Her mother had taught her to take only what was needed, always leaving the strongest specimens to ensure future harvests. The work was peaceful, meditative. Here among the trees, Thora could forget about Lady Astrid's sharp tongue, about empty coin purses and uncertain futures. The forest demanded only respect and patience, offering its gifts freely to those who understood its ways. She moved methodically through her mental list of needed herbs, following half-remembered paths toward the clearings where each variety grew best. It was near the ancient oak, the one her mother had called the grandfather tree, that Thora's peaceful morning shattered like ice beneath a heavy stone. The smell of blood reached her first, metallic and sharp in the clean forest air. Then she saw him, collapsed against the massive trunk like a broken doll, cast aside by some giant child. The stranger lay motionless, his dark hair matted with dried blood, his clothes torn and stained with evidence of recent violence. Thora's first instinct was to turn and run. Every lesson of caution screamed at her to flee back to the safety of Skallavik and report what she had found. This man could be anyone, a bandit, a deserter, even one of the raiders who had been terrorizing the countryside. Helping him could mean bringing danger down upon her entire community. But as she took a step backward, the stranger's eyes fluttered open. They were grey as storm clouds, filled with pain but also with an intelligence that spoke of nobility despite his current condition. In that moment, Thora saw not a potential threat, but a fellow human being suffering and alone. She approached cautiously, her healer's instincts overriding her fears. The man's breathing was shallow and labored, his face pale beneath the dirt and dried blood. Multiple wounds marked his body, a deep gash across his left shoulder, cuts along his arms that spoke of recent combat, and what looked like the beginning of infection in several smaller injuries. "Can you understand me?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. He tried to speak, but managed only a weak grunt of acknowledgement. His eyes tracked her movements with obvious effort, and she could see the fever beginning to build behind his gaze. Without conscious decision, Thora found herself opening her gathering basket. She had brought clean cloth for wrapping. Herbs and her water skin was still mostly full. The stranger needed immediate care if he was going to survive the next few hours, let alone make it through another night in the cold forest. Near the stranger's side lay a war hammer unlike any weapon Thora had ever seen. Its iron head bore intricate runic carvings that seemed to catch and hold the filtered sunlight. The craftsmanship spoke of master smiths and considerable wealth. No common soldier would carry such a weapon, which raised troubling questions about the man's identity. She pushed such concerns aside and focused on the immediate need. Using water from her skin, she began cleaning the worst of his wounds. The stranger bore her ministrations with stoic silence, though she could see the muscles in his jaw clench against the pain. His clothing, while torn and blooded, was of fine quality, wool and leather that spoke of means and status. "I need to move you somewhere safer," she murmured, more to organize her own thoughts than to communicate with the barely conscious man. "There's a cave not far from here, hidden behind a curtain of vines. My mother showed it to me years ago." The stranger's eyes focused on her with obvious effort. His lips moved, forming words in a language she didn't recognize. The syllables were harsh and guttural, nothing like the familiar cadences of her own tongue. This man was definitely from the northern lands, possibly even one of the raiders who had been striking settlements to the east. Fear warred with compassion in Thora's chest. Everything rational told her to leave him and seek help from the village men. But looking at his injuries, she knew he would be dead before she could return with assistance. And despite the mysterious weapon and foreign words, something in his eyes spoke of honor rather than cruelty. She made her decision with the swiftness that had always marked her actions in crisis. Using strips torn from her own undershirt, she bound the worst of his wounds as tightly as she dared. Then, half supporting and half dragging the stranger, she began the difficult journey to the hidden cave. The man was larger than she had first realized, his frame speaking of a warrior's strength even in his weakened state. Progress was slow and exhausting, requiring frequent stops when his consciousness wavered. By the time they reached the vine-covered entrance to the cave, Thora's dress was torn and dirty, and sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the cool air. The cave extended back into the hillside, perhaps 20 paces, its interior dry and surprisingly warm. Her mother had used this place as a shelter during the worst storms, and old traces of previous fires marked a natural hearth near the entrance. Thora settled the stranger against the back wall, using her cloak as padding beneath his head. With practiced efficiency, she gathered dry wood and kindling from the cave's depths. Soon, a small fire crackled near the entrance, its smoke drawing away through natural vents in the rock ceiling. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls and brought blessed warmth to the small space. From her gathering basket, Thora retrieved the herbs she had collected earlier. Wild garlic would help fight infection, while strips of willow bark steeped in hot water would ease his pain and reduce fever. She worked with the quiet concentration her mother had taught her, preparing treatments that had been passed down through generations of healing women. The stranger watched her efforts through half-closed eyes, his expression unreadable. When she brought the bitter willow tea to his lips, he drank without protest, trusting her knowledge despite their inability to communicate. That simple act of faith moved something deep in Thora's heart. As the afternoon light began to fade beyond the cave entrance, she realized the full magnitude of what she had done. She was now committed to caring for this mysterious man, which meant lying to Lady Astrid about her activities and stealing supplies to keep him alive. Discovery would mean immediate dismissal and likely exile from Skallavik. Everything she had worked for since childhood would be lost. Yet as she watched the stranger's breathing grow steadier and his fever begin to break, Thora felt no regret. Her mother had always said that some choices were made not with the mind, but with the soul. This was such a choice, one that felt as inevitable as sunrise despite its obvious risks. The man's eyes opened fully for the first time since she had found him. In their grey depths, she saw gratitude mixed with something else, a recognition that seemed to acknowledge her courage and kindness. He spoke again in his foreign tongue, the words soft and formal, clearly some form of thanks. "Rest now," she said gently, settling beside the fire to keep watch. "Tomorrow we'll see about getting you properly healed." Outside, night was falling over the forest, and somewhere in the darkness, Lady Astrid would be wondering why her servant had not returned from what should have been a simple morning expedition. But those concerns felt distant and unimportant compared to the sacred task of tending to a life that hung by the thinnest of threads. Thora touched her mother's pendant and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. She had chosen compassion over caution, humanity over safety. Now only time would reveal whether that choice would prove to be wisdom or folly. Thora's return to Skallavik that evening required every ounce of acting skill she possessed. Lady Astrid waited in the great hall, her sharp eyes immediately noting the torn dress and dishevelled appearance of her returning servant. "You look as though you wrestled with a wild boar," the older woman observed coldly. "I trust your expedition was more successful than your appearance suggests." "The best herbs grow in difficult places, my lady." Thora kept her voice steady as she displayed her gathering basket, which thankfully contained enough legitimate specimens to support her story. I had to venture deeper into the forest than usual, and the undergrowth proved challenging. Lady Astrid examined the contents of the basket with a practiced eye. Her late husband had valued Thora's healing knowledge, and she had inherited that appreciation along with his lands. Very well. But in future, you will take one of the men with you when venturing so far from the settlement. These are dangerous times. Of course, my lady. Thora bowed respectfully, though her heart pounded at the thought of trying to maintain her deception with a guard in tow. The evening meal passed in a blur of nervous tension. Thora went through the motions of her duties, serving food, clearing tables, banking fires, while her mind remained focused on the stranger lying wounded in the hidden cave. Had his fever broken completely? Were his bandages holding? The questions tormented her as she attempted to maintain her usual routine. Later that night, as the household settled into sleep, Thora quietly gathered supplies for her secret patient. She wrapped bread and cheese in cloth, filled a spare water skin, and selected additional herbs from her carefully organized stores. Each item taken felt like theft, but the alternative was allowing a man to die from neglect. The healing stones came from the hearth itself, smooth river rocks that Lady Astrid used to warm the beds of honored guests. Thora selected 3 of the smaller ones, knowing they would retain heat long enough to provide comfort and aid healing. Her mother had taught her this technique during her childhood illnesses, explaining how warmth helped the body fight infection and pain. Before dawn, she slipped out of the servants' quarters and made her way back to the forest cave. The stranger was awake when she arrived, his grey eyes tracking her movement with obvious alertness. The change in his condition from the previous day was remarkable, testament to both his natural strength and the effectiveness of her treatments. "You came back," he said, in heavily accented but understandable words of her own language. His voice was deep and rough from disuse, but the intelligence behind it was unmistakable. Thora nearly dropped her bundle in surprise. "You speak our tongue?" "Some. Learned from traders." He struggled to sit up straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. "Why help me? You know nothing of who I am." It was a fair question, one that Thora had asked herself repeatedly during the sleepless hours of the night. "My mother taught me that healing knows no boundaries. Pain is pain, regardless of who suffers from it." She busied herself, rekindling the fire and heating the stones she had brought. The mundane tasks helped calm her nerves as she processed the reality of actually conversing with the mysterious man. His accent was thick, but his grasp of grammar suggested significant intelligence and education. "Your mother, she was healer?" he asked, watching her work with obvious interest. "Among other things, she knew herbs, helped birth babies, tended the sick." Thora arranged the heated stones near his injured shoulder, careful not to make them too hot. "She died when I was 8. Fever took her in the space of 3 days." Something shifted in the stranger's expression, a softness that seemed at odds with his warrior's bearing. "Hard thing, losing mother so young." As she changed his bandages, Thora couldn't help but notice the extensive scarring that marked his arms and torso. These were not recent wounds, but the accumulated evidence of a lifetime spent in battle. Yet his hands, while calloused from weapon use, were surprisingly gentle when he assisted with his own care. "You've seen many fights," she observed, more statement than question. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Too many. Fighting becomes habit when you have nothing else. Everyone has something else. Family, friends, a place to call home. Not everyone." His grey eyes stared past her into the shadows of the cave. Some men are born to battle. Is their nature, their fate? Thora sensed deep pain beneath his words, though whether it stemmed from physical wounds or something deeper was impossible to determine. She finished tending his injuries in thoughtful silence, then prepared a meal from the supplies she had brought. The bread was still fresh from Lady Astrid's ovens, and the cheese came from their finest stores. She watched the stranger eat with obvious hunger, noting how he savoured each bite as though it were a feast rather than simple fare. When had he last eaten a proper meal? "What do I call you?" she asked, as they shared the simple breakfast. Again, that long pause. "Eric," he said finally, though something in his tone suggested the name was not entirely true. "I'm Thora. Thora." He repeated her name carefully, as though testing its sound. "Means thunder in the old tongue. My mother said I was born during the worst storm anyone could remember. The thunder shook the walls all through her labor." She smiled at the memory, one of the few stories about her birth that her mother had shared. "She claimed I've been making noise ever since." That earned her something that might have been a smile, though it vanished almost immediately. "Storm-born child grows strong. Your mother chose name well." As the morning progressed, Thora found herself drawn into tentative conversation with the man who called himself Eric. He asked careful questions about her life, her work, her knowledge of herbs and healing. In return, she learned fragments of his own story, or at least the portions he was willing to share. He claimed to be a traveling warrior, seeking employment with various lords and chieftains. His accent and mannerisms suggested northern origins, though he avoided specifics about his homeland. The expensive weapons and quality of his clothing spoke of recent success, though his current condition made clear that his latest employment had ended badly. "The men who did this to you?" Thora asked carefully. "Will they come looking?" "No." His answer was immediate and certain. "They think me dead. Left me for wolves." Something in his tone discouraged further questions about the circumstances of his injuries. Instead, Thora focused on practical matters, his healing timeline, his immediate needs, and the challenge of keeping his presence secret from her community. "I must return before I'm missed," she said, as the sun climbed toward its peak. "But I'll come back this evening with fresh bandages and more food. You take great risk for stranger." His grey eyes studied her face intently. "Why?" Thora considered the question carefully. "Perhaps because kindness is the only thing that separates us from the beasts. If we stop caring for those who suffer, what does that make us?" As she gathered her things to leave, the stranger, Eric, caught her hand gently. His touch was warm despite his recent fever, and she could feel the strength that lay beneath his current weakness. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Walking back through the forest toward Skallavik, Thora realized that something fundamental had shifted in her world. The stranger's presence had awakened feelings and thoughts that had long lay dormant. For the first time in years, she felt truly needed, not just as a servant or a source of labor, but as a healer and a protector. The implications of that realization would have to wait. For now, she had to focus on maintaining her deception and finding ways to continue helping the mysterious man who had stumbled into her carefully ordered existence like a stone thrown into still water. The pattern of deception became Thora's new rhythm of life. Each morning brought the careful theft of supplies, bread wrapped in her apron, healing herbs tucked into hidden pockets, water carried in containers that would not be missed. She had become an expert at explaining her frequent absences, claiming longer and longer expeditions to gather winter stores. 3 days after their first real conversation, Thora arrived at the cave to find Eric attempting to stand on his own. His legs shook with the effort, but the determination in his face was unmistakable. The fever had broken completely, and the angry redness around his wounds had faded to healthy pink. "You heal quickly," she observed, setting down her bundle and moving to steady him as he swayed. "Strong blood," he replied, with what might have been dark humor. "Takes more than a few cuts to stop me." As his strength returned, so did his natural bearing. Even weakened by injury, there was something commanding about the way he held himself. Thora had served in Lady Astrid's household long enough to recognize nobility when she saw it, and everything about Eric spoke of high birth and natural leadership. She had brought her mother's carved wooden cup, a simple vessel worn smooth by generations of use. As she offered him water from it, Eric's fingers brushed hers, and she noticed how carefully he accepted the humble gift. There was reverence in his touch, as though he understood the honor being shown to him. "Tell me about your mother," he said, as they sat by the fire sharing the morning meal. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." The request surprised Thora. In her years of service, few people had shown genuine interest in her family or background. She was simply the orphan girl who cleaned floors and tended fires, her history no more relevant than that of the furniture. She was a healer, as I said. But more than that, she was wise in ways that had nothing to do with book learning. Thora's fingers unconsciously sought her mother's pendant. She could read people's hearts, see their true nature beneath whatever masks they wore. And what would she see in me? Eric's question was quietly serious, his grey eyes fixed on her face. Thora considered carefully before answering. "Pain, I think. Old wounds that never properly healed. But also honor, despite whatever you're running from." Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "You have your mother's gift." "Do I?" She found herself studying his face with new attention. "Then perhaps I should ask what you see in me." Woman who risks everything for stranger, who tends wounds without asking for payment or promise of protection. His voice grew softer. Woman who deserves better than life of servitude. The words hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile. Thora felt heat rise in her cheeks and busied herself with tending the fire. No one had ever suggested she deserved more than her current station. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. As the days passed, their conversations grew longer and more intimate. Eric proved to be surprisingly well educated, able to discuss everything from herb lore to the movements of stars. He spoke of distant lands with the authority of someone who had traveled widely, though he remained vague about the specific circumstances of his journeys. "You know much of warfare," Thora observed one morning as she watched him examine his weapons. The warhammer's intricate carvings seemed to fascinate him, his fingers tracing the runic symbols with obvious familiarity. "Man learns what he must to survive," Eric replied, though his tone suggested there was more to the story. "These runes, they tell of victories, of battles won through strength and cunning. Can you read them?" "Some." He set the weapon aside carefully. "Old knowledge, passed down through generations of warriors. My father taught me before." He stopped abruptly, as though realizing he had revealed more than intended. Thora didn't press for details, but the slip confirmed her growing suspicion that Eric was far more than a simple sellsword. The quality of his weapons, his educated speech, his natural assumption of authority, all pointed to noble birth and high rank. The mystery deepened when she noticed him exercising, despite his healing wounds. His movements were fluid and precise, speaking of years of training with master weapons instructors. No common warrior developed such reflexes or such perfect balance. This man had been raised from childhood to fight, bred for leadership and conquest. Yet with her, he showed only gentleness. When she changed his bandages, his powerful hands remained perfectly still, despite what must have been considerable pain. When she stumbled on the uneven cave floor, he caught her with reflexes that spoke of a protector's instincts. The contrast between his obvious capacity for violence and his careful tenderness puzzled and intrigued her. "Why do you trust me?" she asked one evening, as they shared their simple meal by firelight. "Because you saved my life when you could have walked away," he answered without hesitation. "Because you risk your own safety every day to care for me. Because—" he paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Because when I look at you, I remember what it means to be human, rather than just warrior." The admission hung between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Thora felt her heart racing as she met his steady gaze. Something was building between them, a connection that went far beyond healer and patient. Yet she was acutely aware of the vast gulf that separated their stations in life. "I should go," she said softly, though every instinct urged her to stay. "Lady Astrid will notice if I'm gone too long." "Of course." But Eric's hand caught hers as she rose to leave. "Thora, be careful. I hear tension in your voice when you speak of your mistress. If she discovers what you're doing—" "She won't," Thora said, with more confidence than she felt. "I've been careful." "Have you?" His grip tightened slightly. "You've been stealing supplies, lying about your activities, disappearing for hours at a time. How long before someone notices?" The question struck closer to home than she cared to admit. Kari had already made several pointed comments about Thora's recent behavior, and Lady Astrid's sharp eyes missed nothing for long. The web of deception was growing more complex with each passing day, and the strain was beginning to show. "A few more days," she said, though whether she was reassuring him or herself remained unclear. "Just until you're strong enough to travel." And then? The question she had been avoiding faced her starkly in the firelight. What would happen when Eric was healed? Would he simply disappear back into whatever dangerous life had brought him to her forest? The thought left an ache in her chest that she didn't fully understand. "Then you'll be free to return to your life, and I'll return to mine." Eric's expression grew unreadable. Perhaps freedom is not as simple as we think. As she made her way back through the darkening forest, Thora carried those words with her like a puzzle to be solved. Freedom. The concept seemed increasingly complex. She was free to make her own choices, as her decision to help Eric proved. Yet she remained bound by circumstance, duty, and the simple need to survive. More troubling still was the growing realization that she no longer wanted Eric to leave. His presence had awakened something within her that she had never known existed, a sense of being truly seen and valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. The thought of returning to her old life of quiet service felt like a kind of death. But what alternative existed? She was a servant girl with nothing to offer but empty hands and a kind heart. He was clearly nobility, destined for a world far beyond her reach. Their brief connection, however meaningful, could never survive the harsh realities of their different stations. As Skallavik's walls came into view, Thora pushed such thoughts aside and focused on the immediate challenge of maintaining her deception for another night. Tomorrow would bring new worries and new choices. For now, it was enough that both she and Eric were alive and healing in their different ways. The golden arm ring fell from Eric's belongings as Thora helped him move to a more comfortable position near the cave entrance. The precious metal caught the morning light, its intricate braided design speaking of master craftsmen and considerable wealth. But it was the weight of the piece that truly marked its significance. This was not mere decoration, but a symbol of high rank and noble blood. Eric moved to retrieve it quickly, but not before Thora had seen the inscription running along its inner surface. The runes were different from those on his warhammer, more formal and ceremonial. Even without being able to read them, she recognized the marks of royal inscription. "A gift from a grateful lord?" she asked carefully, settling beside him with her morning supplies. "Something like that." Eric's fingers closed around the ring protectively. "From my father, actually. Before he died." The admission surprised them both. In all their conversations, Eric had revealed precious little about his family or background. This glimpse into his past felt significant, though Thora sensed there was far more to the story than he was willing to share. "He must have valued you greatly to give you such a piece." Eric's laugh held no humor. "He valued what I represented, the continuation of his bloodline, the promise of future conquest. Whether he valued me as a son is another question entirely." There was old pain in those words, the kind that came from wounds that never properly healed. Thora had learned to recognize such hurt in her years of tending both physical and emotional injuries. Some scars ran too deep for any herb or poultice to reach. "Did you disappoint him?" she asked gently. "Constantly." Eric turned the arm ring over in his hands, studying its surface as though seeing it for the first time. "I was too soft," he claimed, "too willing to show mercy when strength was required. He said it would be my downfall." The confession hung between them in the morning air. Thora found herself studying Eric's profile as he spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened with remembered conflict. Here was the source of the contradiction she had sensed in him. The warrior, trained for violence, who showed such careful gentleness. "Perhaps mercy is not weakness," she offered quietly. "Perhaps it takes more strength to stay your hand than to strike." Eric looked at her then with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "You sound like her." "Her?" "My mother. She used to say similar things when my father's lessons grew too harsh." His voice softened with memory. "She died when I was 12. Fever, like yours." The parallel struck Thora deeply. Both of them had lost their mothers young. Both had been shaped by that loss in ways that continued to echo through their lives. It explained something about the careful way Eric handled her simple wooden cup, the reverence he showed for her small kindnesses. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it completely. Losing a mother's wisdom when you most need guidance, it leaves a particular kind of emptiness. Yes. The single word carried volumes of shared understanding, though perhaps we are fortunate to have known such love at all, even briefly. As Eric's strength continued to return, Thora began to notice other details that spoke to his true station, the way he unconsciously straightened when speaking of serious matters, as though addressing subordinates who expected authority, the careful precision of his movements, trained from childhood to project command, the expectation that his words would be heeded, his decisions respected. Most telling was his reaction to her service. Where a common man might have accepted her care as his due, Eric showed constant awareness of the sacrifice she was making. He thanked her for each small kindness, apologized for the trouble he caused, and clearly struggled with accepting help he could not repay. "You were raised to command," Thora observed as she watched him methodically check his healing wounds. Even this simple task was performed with military precision. Among other things, Eric's tone suggested the topic was not entirely welcome. Command brings responsibility. Responsibility brings choices that keep you awake at night. What kind of choices? The question hung unanswered for long moments. When Eric finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. The kind that define what manner of man you truly are. The kind that echo through generations. Thora sensed she was approaching the heart of whatever had driven him to her forest, whatever battle had left him wounded and, apparently, alone. The expensive weapons, the noble bearing, the gold arm ring, all suggested a man of significant rank who had somehow fallen from grace or position. "Is that why you're here?" she asked carefully. "Because of a choice that went wrong?" Eric's grey eyes met hers directly. "I made a choice that my father would have called weakness. My men called it betrayal. Perhaps they were both right. But you believe it was necessary. I believe it was human." His hand found hers where it rested beside his healing shoulder. Sometimes being human and being a leader require different responses to the same situation. The touch sent warmth through Thora's entire body. His fingers were warm and calloused from weapon work, but his touch remained gentle despite the obvious strength behind it. She found herself studying their joined hands, her small, work-roughened fingers intertwined with his larger ones, marked by the scars of battle. "Tell me about your life," Eric said suddenly. "Not your work or your duties, but your dreams. What did you want before circumstances made your choices for you?" The question caught Thora off guard. No one had ever asked about her dreams, her desires beyond the immediate needs of survival. I never really allowed myself to think in such terms." "Think now." She considered carefully, aware that her answer would reveal more about herself than she had shared with anyone. "I suppose I dreamed of having a home that was truly mine, a place where I could tend a garden and help people without asking permission. Children, perhaps, who could grow up safe and loved. Simple dreams. Perhaps, but they seemed impossible for someone in my position. Did they?" Eric's thumb traced gentle patterns across her knuckles. "Or did you simply believe they were impossible because others told you so?" The question stirred something rebellious in Thora's chest. All her life, she had accepted the limitations placed upon her by birth and circumstance. The idea that she might choose a different path had never seriously occurred to her. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting attention from her own revelations. "What dreams did the son of a great lord harbor?" Eric was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were barely above a whisper. "I dreamed of being worthy of the power I would inherit, of leading men who followed from loyalty rather than fear, of building something that would outlast the sword. Noble aspirations, naive ones according to my father. He believed that power came only through strength, that mercy was a luxury weak men used to justify their failures." Thora studied his face in the firelight, seeing the conflict that still raged behind his calm exterior. "And what do you believe?" "I believe that strength without mercy becomes tyranny, that power without compassion destroys both the ruler and the ruled." His grip on her hand tightened slightly. "I believe that my father was wrong about many things, though it cost me everything to learn it." The admission felt like a gift, a glimpse into the heart of the man behind the warrior's mask. Thora found herself leaning closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice and the pain in his grey eyes. "Perhaps losing everything was necessary to discover who you truly are," she said softly. perhaps. Eric's other hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch feather-light against her skin. Or perhaps I needed to lose everything to be worthy of something better. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and unspoken longing. Thora felt her heart racing as she met his steady gaze, aware that they were crossing into territory that could never be retraced. Then the sound of approaching voices echoed through the forest, and the spell was broken. The voices belonged to hunters from Skallavik, their familiar tones carrying through the forest as they tracked deer along the old paths. Thora and Eric froze in the cave entrance, barely breathing as the men passed within 20 paces of their hidden refuge. The vine curtain that concealed the cave mouth might as well have been gossamer for all the protection it seemed to offer. "Tracks lead toward the old oak," one voice was saying. "Big stag, from the size of the prints." "We'll need to move carefully," replied another. "Lady Astrid wants fresh meat for the winter stores, but she'll have our hides if we venture too far from the settlement." The voices faded as the hunters continued deeper into the forest, but their presence had shattered the intimate moment between Thora and Eric. She pulled back from his touch, suddenly aware of how close they had come to discovery, and to something far more dangerous than being caught harboring a stranger. "They're hunting closer to the cave," she whispered, gathering her supplies with shaking hands. "It's not safe for you here anymore." Eric nodded grimly, his warrior's instincts already assessing the changed situation. "How long before they return this way?" "Hours, perhaps. But others might follow. The hunting parties have been ranging farther each day as the game grows scarce." Thora's mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. "There's another place, deeper in the forest. An old woodsman's shelter near the stone circle. It's further from the settlement, but more secluded." "Can I travel that distance?" She studied his condition carefully. The past week had seen remarkable improvement in his wounds, but he was still far from full strength. A journey of several miles through rough terrain would test his endurance. Yet staying here was no longer an option. "We'll have to risk it." As they prepared for the move, Eric retrieved something from his pack that made Thora's breath catch. It was a black raven feather, perfectly preserved and bound with thin silver wire. The craftsmanship was exquisite, but more significant was what the token represented. Ravens were sacred to Odin, the All-Father, and such feathers were carried only by his most favored warriors. "Another gift from your father?" she asked, as Eric tucked the feather carefully into his belt pouch. "From my king," he replied, then seemed to realize the significance of his admission. "It's a mark of honor, given to those who serve with distinction." The revelation sent a chill through Thora. If Eric carried such a token, he was no mere warrior seeking employment. He was a man of high rank in service to royalty. The implications were staggering and terrifying. "What king?" she asked quietly. Eric met her eyes directly, and she saw the moment when he made his decision to trust her with the truth. "Harold Bluetooth, King of the Danes, though I suspect my service to him has ended along with everything else." The name struck Thora like a physical blow. Harold Bluetooth was legendary, even in their remote corner of the world. A king whose power stretched across vast territories, whose warriors were feared from the Baltic to the Irish Sea. If Eric served such a master, then he was far more than noble. He was royalty himself, or close to it. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" Eric's voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical weariness. "Whatever I was before, I am now simply a man who owes his life to a woman with a kind heart." But it did matter, and they both knew it. The gulf between them had just become an unbridgeable chasm. She was a servant girl from a forgotten settlement. He was nobility of the highest order. Whatever connection had been growing between them was impossible, a fantasy born of circumstances that could never survive in the real world. They made the journey to the abandoned shelter in careful stages, Eric leaning heavily on her shoulder whenever his strength flagged. The stone circle proved to be ancient beyond memory, massive granite monoliths arranged in patterns that spoke of old gods and forgotten rituals. The woodsman's hut huddled nearby like a modest afterthought to the monument's grandeur. The shelter was larger than the cave, but in poor repair. Thora spent precious time making it habitable, while Eric rested against one of the standing stones, his face grey with exhaustion from the journey. She noted how he positioned himself to maintain watch over the forest approaches. Even weakened, his strategic thinking remained sharp. The old gods still hold power here, Eric observed as he watched her work. I can feel their presence in the stones. My mother used to bring me here on feast days, Thora replied, spreading his cloak over a makeshift bed of pine boughs. She said the circle was here before the first settlements, before men learned to work iron or build walls. Wise woman. Places like this remember the old ways, when gods walked among men and heroes were born from mortal choices. As evening fell, they settled beside a carefully concealed fire, sharing the meal Thora had brought from Skallavik. The food reminded her of the growing complexity of her deception, and Eric seemed to sense her troubled thoughts. Your mistress suspects something, he said. It wasn't a question. Lady Astrid misses nothing for long. My friend Kari has been asking pointed questions about my recent behavior. Thora stared into the flames, seeing her carefully constructed lies beginning to unravel. I can maintain the pretense for perhaps another few days. No more. Then you must stop coming here. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? You've risked enough for my sake. I won't be the cause of your ruin. Eric's voice was firm despite the pain she could see in his eyes. I'm strong enough now to fend for myself. You've given me my life. I won't take your future as well. That's not your choice to make, isn't it? He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. I am Eric Bloodaxe, son of Harold Bluetooth, war chief of the Northern Territories. Do you understand what that means? The name struck her like thunder. Eric Bloodaxe. She had heard stories of him around winter fires, tales of a warrior prince whose reputation for both courage and cruelty had spread across the known world. Yet the man before her seemed nothing like those fearsome legends. It means, she said carefully, that you're not Eric, the wandering warrior seeking employment. It means I'm a man whose enemies would stop at nothing to see him dead, whose mere presence puts everyone around him in mortal danger. His voice grew rough with emotion. It means you've been harboring the son of kings, and when my identity is discovered, as it inevitably will be, you'll be branded a collaborator with the enemy. Thora absorbed this revelation in silence, understanding finally why he had been so evasive about his past, why trained warriors had left him for dead, why his weapons and bearing spoke of the highest nobility. She was not just hiding a wounded stranger, she was protecting one of the most powerful men in the northern world. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I hoped, foolishly, that I could simply be Eric to you. A man you saved from death, nothing more. His hand found hers in the darkness. Because for the first time in my life, someone looked at me and saw not a weapon to be wielded or a name to be feared, but simply a human being worthy of compassion. The admission broke something open in Thora's chest. All her life, She had been defined by others, as an orphan, a servant, a convenient pair of hands. Eric had been defined as well, but by vastly different forces, as heir, warrior, symbol of royal power. In their secret meetings, both had discovered the freedom to be simply themselves. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Eric's grip on her hand tightened. "Now you return to your life and forget you ever found me. In a few days, when I'm strong enough to travel properly, I'll disappear. You'll be safe. And you? I'll find my way. I always have." But Thora could hear the uncertainty beneath his confident words. Without allies, resources, or sanctuary, even Eric Bloodaxe faced a precarious future. The thought of him wandering alone and hunted filled her with a fierce protectiveness she had no right to feel. "There has to be another way." "There isn't." Eric's voice was gentle but final. "Some roads can only be walked alone." As the fire died to embers and they settled for what might be their last night together, Thora found herself memorizing every detail, the sound of his breathing, the way firelight played across his scarred hands, the careful distance he maintained despite the obvious desire to hold her close. Tomorrow would bring new choices and harsh realities. But tonight, in the shadow of the ancient stones, she allowed herself to imagine a world where love could conquer the barriers of birth and circumstance. It was a dangerous dream, but sometimes dreams were all that stood between hope and despair. The confrontation with Lady Astrid came at dawn, 3 days after Eric had revealed his true identity. Thora had been preparing what she intended as her final visit to the stone circle when her mistress appeared in the servants' quarters, flanked by 2 of the household guards. "Empty your bundle," Lady Astrid commanded, her voice cutting through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. Thora's hands trembled as she untied the cloth wrapping. The contents spilled across her sleeping palate. Bread, cheese, strips of linen for bandages, and a small clay pot of healing salve. The evidence of her deception lay exposed for all to see. "Interesting provisions for herb gathering," Lady Astrid observed coldly. "Medical supplies suggest you've been tending someone's wounds, someone you've taken great care to hide from this household." The older woman's pale eyes missed nothing as she catalogued the stolen items. Each piece of bread, every strip of cloth, had been carefully accounted for in her mental inventory. Thora's careful thefts had finally accumulated into undeniable proof. "I can explain," Thora began, but Lady Astrid raised her hand for silence. "You will explain nothing until I've seen this mysterious patient for myself." She turned to the guards. "Bring her." The journey through the forest felt like a march to execution. Thora's mind raced with desperate plans. Perhaps she could claim Eric had already fled, lead them to the cave instead of the stone circle, buy him time to escape. But Lady Astrid's guards knew these woods as well as she did, and the direct path to the ancient monuments was impossible to disguise. As they approached the standing stones, Thora's heart sank. Smoke rose from the concealed fire, and she could see Eric moving carefully among the monoliths, practicing weapon forms with a long branch in place of his warhammer. His movements were fluid and precise, despite his healing injuries, displaying the deadly grace that had made him legendary. "Stay back," Lady Astrid commanded as they reached the circle's edge. Her face had gone pale at the sight of the tall figure among the stones. "That man moves like no common soldier." Eric sensed their presence and turned slowly, branch still in hand, but held casually rather than as a weapon. Even at a distance, his natural authority was unmistakable. He studied the small group with the calculating gaze of a commander assessing potential threats. "My lady," Thora said desperately. "He means no harm. He was wounded and near death when I found him." "Silence." Lady Astrid's voice carried a tremor that spoke of genuine fear. "I know those movements, that bearing. I've seen warriors of the royal court move in exactly that manner." Eric began walking toward them with measured steps, and Thora saw Lady Astrid's guards instinctively shift their stance. These were experienced men who had faced raiders and wolves, but something about the approaching figure made them nervous. "You have nothing to fear from me," Eric called out, his accent thick but his words clear. "I am guest in your lands, under protection of your servant's mercy." "Guest?" Lady Astrid's laugh held no humor. "Guests announce themselves and request hospitality. They do not skulk in forests being tended by stolen supplies." Eric stopped perhaps 10 paces away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid appearing threatening. In the morning light, his noble bearing was impossible to deny. Even wearing travel-stained clothes and bearing the marks of recent injury, he carried himself like a man accustomed to command. "You are right to be cautious," he said formally. "I am Eric Bloodaxe, son of Harold Bluetooth, war chief of the Northern Territories. Your servant found me near death, and has shown me kindness beyond any reasonable duty." The name hit the group like a physical blow. One of the guards actually stepped backward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sword hilt. Lady Astrid's face went ashen, and she gripped Thora's arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Eric Bloodaxe," she repeated in a whisper. "The scourge of the western seas, the wolf of Denmark." "Among other titles," Eric acknowledged grimly, "though I suspect those particular honors have been stripped from me, along with everything else." Thora stared at him in shock. She had known he was nobility, even royalty, but the full weight of his reputation had not truly registered. Eric Bloodaxe was not just a war chief, he was a legend, a figure whose exploits were sung in halls across the known world, and she had been feeding him bread and cheese like any common invalid. "What are you doing here?" Lady Astrid demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. "What brings the son of kings to our remote settlement?" Eric's grey eyes found Thora's face, and she saw something shift in his expression. "I was betrayed by men I trusted, left for dead in your forest. Your servant could have walked away and let the wolves finish their work. Instead, she chose mercy." "Mercy?" Lady Astrid's grip on Thora's arm tightened. "Do you have any idea what you've done, girl? Harboring the enemies of our king, providing aid to Denmark's war chief, this is treason of the highest order." "He was dying," Thora said quietly, finding her voice at last. "I couldn't just leave him to suffer." "You could and you should have." Lady Astrid turned back to Eric with barely controlled panic. "Your presence here threatens everything we've built. If word reaches the wrong ears, our entire settlement could be branded collaborators." Eric nodded gravely. "Your concerns are justified, which is why I intended to leave before my identity could endanger anyone." From his belt, he withdrew something that made Lady Astrid gasp. It was a medallion of iron worked into the shape of a wolf's head, its eyes set with small garnets that caught the morning light. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, but more significant was what it represented: the personal emblem of Eric Bloodaxe, symbol of his authority and royal lineage. "This is who I am," he said simply, holding the Iron Wolf medallion where they could all see it clearly. "Son of Harold, heir to the Northern throne, war chief of 1,000 battles. Everything you've heard about me is likely true. I have burned settlements, conquered territories, shown no mercy to those who opposed my father's will." He paused, his eyes returning to Thora's face. "But your servant saw past all of that. She saw only a wounded man in need of help, and she chose compassion over fear. For that kindness, I am in her debt. Lady Astrid studied the medallion with the eye of someone who understood its significance. Such tokens were not easily forged or casually given. This was genuine proof of Eric's identity, which made their situation infinitely more dangerous. "What do you want from us?" she asked carefully. "Nothing." Eric's answer was immediate and sincere. "I want only to disappear from your lives before my presence brings disaster upon you. Give me one more day to regain my full strength, and I'll vanish. You can claim ignorance of my identity if questioned." "And if you're lying? If this is some elaborate trick to gain our trust before revealing your true purpose?" Eric smiled grimly and gestured toward his healing wounds. "What possible purpose could justify nearly dying in your forest? If I meant harm to your settlement, there are far more efficient approaches than collapsing from blood loss among your trees." The logic was sound, but Lady Astrid remained suspicious. Men like you always have schemes within schemes. How do we know this isn't some complex strategy to infiltrate our defenses? "Because," Eric said quietly, his gaze never leaving Thora's face, "some things matter more than strategy or conquest. Your servant has shown me that mercy and kindness still exist in this world. I would die before repaying such gifts with betrayal." The sincerity in his voice seemed to penetrate even Lady Astrid's fear. She studied his face carefully, perhaps seeing for the first time the man beneath the fearsome reputation. "One day," she said finally. "You have until sunset tomorrow, then you disappear forever. And if word of this reaches anyone beyond those present, I'll hunt you down myself." Eric bowed formally, a gesture of respect from royalty to a fellow leader. "You have my word, sworn on my father's name and my mother's memory. No harm will come to your people through my presence." As they prepared to leave, Eric caught Thora's hand briefly. The touch was gentle but charged with unspoken emotion. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Lady Astrid noticed the exchange, and her expression hardened further. "You, girl, will come with me now. We have much to discuss about your future in this household." As they walked back through the forest, Thora felt her world collapsing around her. Eric would be gone within a day, vanishing back into the dangerous world of royal politics and military campaigns. She would likely be dismissed from Lady Astrid's service, branded as untrustworthy and possibly worse. But as she touched her mother's pendant, Thora realized she felt no regret for her choices. She had saved a life, shown compassion to someone in desperate need, and discovered that her own capacity for love was deeper than she had ever imagined. Whatever consequences followed, she had acted with honor and humanity. The Iron Wolf medallion remained burned in her memory, symbol of everything that separated her world from Eric's. Yet she also remembered the gentleness in his grey eyes, the careful way he had held her hand, the vulnerability he had shown when speaking of his mother's death. Tomorrow he would be gone, but the impact of their brief connection would echo through both their lives forever. The confrontation in Lady Astrid's private chamber was more devastating than any physical punishment. Thora stood before the great oak desk where her mistress conducted the business of the estate, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from trembling. The older woman's pale eyes held a mixture of disappointment and barely controlled fury. 12 years, Lady Astrid said quietly, each word carrying the weight of a stone. 12 years you have served in this household. I watched you grow from a frightened child into a woman I trusted with my most precious possessions. And this is how you repay that trust. Thora wanted to explain, to make her mistress understand the impossible choice she had faced, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. How could she describe the compulsion that had driven her to risk everything for a stranger? How could she justify actions that now seemed foolishly naive? "I found a man dying in the forest," she said finally. "I couldn't walk away and let him perish. You found Eric Bloodaxe, one of the most dangerous men alive, and you brought him to within miles of our walls." Lady Astrid's voice rose with each word. "Do you understand what you've done? What you've risked?" He was helpless, wounded and fevered. Whatever danger he might represent, he posed none in that condition. "No danger?" Lady Astrid stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "His very presence here is an act of war. If King Olaf's forces discover we've harboured Denmark's war chief, every soul in Skallavik will pay the price." The mention of King Olaf sent a chill through Thora. She had heard enough court gossip to understand the delicate political situation. Norway and Denmark existed in a state of constant tension, with border raids and territorial disputes threatening to explode into open warfare at any moment. Harbouring a Danish prince would indeed be seen as treachery of the highest order. "He gave his word to leave," Thora said desperately. "Tomorrow at sunset, he'll disappear. No one else need ever know he was here." Lady Astrid's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "His word? The word of a man whose reputation is built on conquest and betrayal. You truly are a naive child." But even as she spoke the harsh words, Lady Astrid's expression shifted slightly. Something in Eric's demeanour at the stone circle had impressed her, some quality of honour that transcended his fearsome reputation. "Still," she continued more thoughtfully, "he could have killed us all at the circle if he chose. A man of his skills, even wounded, would have made short work of 2 guards and a pair of women. He's not the monster the stories paint him," Thora said quickly, sensing an opening. "Yes, he's a warrior, but he's also capable of gentleness and mercy. He could have taken what he needed by force, but instead he accepted help with gratitude." Lady Astrid studied her servant's face with shrewd eyes. "You care for him?" It wasn't a question, and Thora saw no point in denial. "I do." A servant girl in love with a royal war chief. Do you understand how impossible such a situation is? The gulf between your stations is not merely vast, it's unbridgeable. Thora's hand moved unconsciously to her mother's pendant. "I understand the realities of our different births, but caring for someone doesn't require hope of reciprocation. Doesn't it?" Lady Astrid's tone grew gentler. "I've seen how he looks at you, girl. That man carries feelings as deep as yours, which makes this situation even more dangerous." The admission struck Thora like a physical blow. She had sensed Eric's growing attachment, but had not dared believe it could match the depth of her own feelings. The knowledge that her emotions were returned made the approaching separation infinitely more painful. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Lady Astrid was silent for long moments, her fingers drumming against the desktop as she weighed options and consequences. "I should dismiss you immediately and report Eric's presence to the regional authorities. That would be the safe, sensible course. But I remember what it was like to be young and believe that love could overcome any obstacle." Lady Astrid's expression grew distant with memory. "I once loved a man whose station made marriage impossible. I chose duty over heart, and though it was the right decision, I've regretted it every day since." Thora felt a glimmer of hope, though she dared not voice it. "Here is what will happen," Lady Astrid continued briskly. "You will not visit him again. Tomorrow evening, after he departs, you will return to your duties as though nothing has occurred. We will speak of this to no one, and if questioned, we will claim complete ignorance of his presence. And my position here remains unchanged, provided you give me your word that such deception will never occur again." Relief flooded through Thora, though it was tempered by the reality that Eric would soon be gone forever. "You have my word, my lady, and my gratitude. Save your gratitude. You may not thank me when you realize what keeping this secret will cost." Lady Astrid returned to her chair, suddenly looking older than her years. Some secrets become burdens that grow heavier with time. That evening, as the household settled into sleep, Thora lay on her straw pallet, staring at the ceiling beams. Tomorrow would bring Eric's departure and the end of the most meaningful connection she had ever experienced. The knowledge that he returned her feelings only made the approaching loss more devastating. She must have dozed, because she woke to find moonlight streaming through the small window above her head. The servants' quarters were quiet, except for the gentle snoring of her fellow workers. Moving carefully to avoid waking anyone, Thora rose and made her way to the small chamber where she stored her herbs and medical supplies. If this was to be their last meeting, she wanted to give Eric something that might serve him in the dangerous world he was returning to. She selected her finest healing herbs, wrapping them in clean cloth along with written instructions for their use. Her mother had taught her to read and write, rare skills for a woman of her station, and she used that knowledge to create a detailed guide for treating wounds and infections. As she worked by candlelight, Thora found herself remembering every detail of their time together. The way Eric's eyes had softened when she told him about her mother, his careful gentleness when she tended his wounds, the moment by the fire when he had almost kissed her, before the hunters' voices interrupted them. Most of all, she remembered his words about mercy and strength, his struggle to be worthy of the power he would inherit. Whatever had driven him from Denmark, whatever betrayal had led to his exile, she believed in the fundamental goodness she had seen beneath his warriors' exterior. A soft sound from outside made her freeze. Footsteps in the courtyard, careful but unmistakably approaching. Thora extinguished her candle and crept to the window, peering through the shutters into the moonlit yard. Eric stood in the shadows near the main gate, wrapped in a dark cloak that made him nearly invisible. He was looking toward the servants' quarters with an expression of longing that matched her own. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and Thora felt her heart stop. He raised his hand in a gesture of farewell, and she pressed her palm against the shutter in response. Then he turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving her with only the memory of that final connection. But as Thora returned to her pallet, she discovered something that changed everything. Lying on her pillow was an object that shouldn't exist, a ceremonial wedding torque, ornate and beautiful, crafted from silver and set with small garnets that caught the moonlight like drops of blood. The implications hit her with stunning force. Such torques were reserved for the highest nobility, given only when royal houses contracted marriages of equal station. This was not merely a token of affection, but a formal proposal, an offer of marriage that would elevate her from servant to princess. Attached to the torque was a small piece of parchment bearing a message in Eric's careful script. "If you would have me, meet me at dawn at the old oak where we first found each other. I offer not just my heart, but my name, my protection, and whatever future we can build together." Thora sank onto her sleeping pallet, the torque trembling in her hands. Eric was offering her everything she had never dared dream of: love, status, security, and a life beyond the confines of servitude. But accepting would mean leaving everything she had ever known. joining her fate to a man whose very name inspired fear across the known world. The choice before her was impossible. Stay and live safely in familiar servitude, or risk everything for a love that might be the greatest joy or the greatest tragedy of her life. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Thora clutched the wedding torque to her chest and tried to find the courage to choose between the life she knew and the destiny she had never imagined possible. The ancient oak awaited her answer, and with it, the future that would define the rest of her days. Dawn arrived, wrapped in mist and uncertainty, as Thora made her way through the forest toward the ancient oak. The ceremonial wedding torque lay hidden beneath her woolen cloak, its weight both precious and terrifying against her heart. With each step along the familiar path, she felt the magnitude of the choice before her growing heavier. The great oak stood exactly as she remembered from that fateful morning when she had first found Eric bleeding among its roots. But now the tree seemed transformed into something more significant, a threshold between her old life and an unimaginable future. Eric waited beside the massive trunk, his tall figure silhouetted against the pale morning sky. He had regained much of his strength over the past weeks, and his natural authority was unmistakable even in the forest's quiet solitude. Yet when he saw her approaching, his expression revealed the vulnerability beneath the warrior's mask. This was not Eric Bloodaxe, the legendary war chief, but simply a man hoping for love to overcome the barriers of birth and circumstance. "You came," he said softly as she drew near. "I had to know if this was real." Thora's voice was barely above a whisper as she withdrew the torque from beneath her cloak. A ceremonial marriage collar for a servant girl. It seems like something from the old stories. Eric's grey eyes never left her face. "It's as real as the feelings that drove me to offer it. As real as the choice that brought you to save my life when you could have walked away." The sincerity in his voice made her heart race. "Do you understand what you're asking? I'm nobody, Eric. A servant with no dowry, no family connections, no political value. Marrying me gains you nothing. It gains me everything that matters." He took a careful step closer, his hands hanging loose at his sides to avoid appearing threatening. "In all my years of conquest and political maneuvering, I've never found anything as precious as the kindness you showed a dying stranger." Thora looked down at the torque in her hands, studying the intricate silverwork that represented a life she had never imagined possible. "Your father's enemies will use such a marriage against you. They'll say it proves your weakness, your unfitness for command. Let them say what they will. I've spent my entire life trying to live up to my father's expectations, to be the weapon he forged me to become." Eric's voice grew stronger with conviction. "But you've shown me that strength without compassion becomes cruelty, that power without mercy destroys both ruler and ruled." The words echoed their earlier conversations when he had spoken of the conflict between his father's harsh teachings and his own instincts toward mercy. Thora began to understand that her choice represented more than personal happiness. It was Eric's rejection of the brutal legacy he had inherited. "I would be a liability," she said quietly. "A target for your enemies, a weakness they could exploit. You would be my strength." Eric extended his hand, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. "The courage that made you risk everything for a stranger. That's the quality I need beside me. Not political connections or military alliances, but the moral clarity to choose what's right over what's expedient." Thora stared at his outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would change everything irrevocably. "What kind of life could we have together? Your heir to a throne, born to command armies and rule territories. I know nothing of such responsibilities. Then we'll learn together. My birthright comes with obligations I've long struggled to fulfill honorably. Perhaps with your wisdom to guide me, I can become the leader my people truly need, rather than merely another conqueror. The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and implications. Eric was offering not just marriage, but partnership in reshaping the very nature of royal power. Yet Thora couldn't ignore the dangers such a path would entail. "Your followers will never accept me," she said, though her resolve was weakening with each word. "The ones worth keeping will learn to value you as I do. The rest—" Eric shrugged with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to imposing his will through strength. "The rest will adapt or find service elsewhere." From his belt, Eric withdrew something that made Thora's breath catch, a sacred oath ring, plain silver inscribed with ancient runes. Such rings were used for the most solemn vows, binding those who wore them with oaths that could not be broken without divine retribution. "If you accept my proposal," he said formally, "we'll speak our vows here beneath this tree, with the old gods as witnesses. Our marriage will be as binding as any ceremony performed in great halls before assembled nobles." The ring seemed to pulse with power in the morning light. Thora understood that this moment would define not only her future, but also Eric's transformation from conqueror to something more hopeful, a leader guided by compassion rather than mere ambition. "Once spoken, such vows cannot be undone," she said, though whether she was warning him or herself remained unclear. "I know." Eric's voice carried absolute certainty. "I want no way back from this choice. Either we build something worthy together, or we fail together. But we face whatever comes as equals, bound by love and sacred oath." Thora felt the last of her resistance crumble as she looked into his steady grey eyes. This man had shown her gentleness despite his reputation for violence, had offered her equality despite the vast gulf in their stations. He was asking her to step into legend, to become part of a story that would echo through generations. "Yes," she whispered. Then more strongly, "Yes, I'll marry you." The ceremony beneath the ancient oak was simple yet profound, witnessed only by the morning mist and the spirits of the old gods. Eric placed the sacred oath ring on Thora's finger, with hands that trembled slightly, despite his warrior's composure. The silver felt warm against her skin, as though it carried the weight of destiny itself. "By Odin's wisdom and Thor's strength," Eric spoke the ancient words with solemn reverence, "I take you as my wife, my equal, my companion in all things. Your courage shall be my guidance, your compassion my strength." Thora's voice was steady as she repeated the binding words her mother had taught her from the old traditions. "By Frigg's blessing and Freya's grace, I take you as my husband, my protector, my partner in whatever fate awaits. Your honor shall be my shield, your love my sanctuary." As their vows echoed among the ancient trees, something shifted in the very air around them. The mist seemed to swirl with purpose, and for a moment Thora could have sworn she felt the presence of watching gods, lending their approval to this union that defied all convention. Eric reached into his pack and withdrew his most precious possession, the wolf pelt cloak that marked him as a royal war chief. The dark fur gleamed with silver threads woven throughout, creating patterns that caught and held the filtered sunlight. This was more than mere clothing. It was the symbol of his authority and lineage. "This cloak has been worn by my father and his father before him," Eric said, as he lifted the magnificent garment. It marks the bearer as ruler, as protector of the people, as one who leads through strength tempered by wisdom. He placed the heavy cloak around Thora's shoulders, and she felt the weight of centuries settling upon her. The fur was surprisingly soft, warmed by Eric's body heat, and carrying the faint scent of pine forests and distant seas. "Now you are truly my queen," he whispered against her ear as he fastened the cloak's silver clasps. Not through birth or political arrangement, but through choice and sacred oath. The transformation was remarkable. Draped in the royal cloak, Thora no longer looked like a servant girl playing at nobility. She carried herself differently, as though the garment itself had awakened some dormant strength within her. Eric stepped back to study his new wife, his expression filled with wonder and pride. "You were born for this," he said quietly. "I can see it now. The bearing, the natural dignity that no amount of servitude could diminish." From the forest around them came the sound of approaching horses, hoofbeats muffled by the thick moss, but growing steadily closer. Eric's hand moved instinctively toward his warhammer, but his posture remained protective rather than aggressive. "My men," he explained as armed figures emerged from the mist. "They've been searching for me since the ambush that left me wounded." A dozen warriors on horseback materialized from the forest shadows, their weapons drawn but lowered in respect as they recognized their leader. These were hardened veterans, scarred by countless battles, yet they dismounted and knelt when they saw Eric standing whole and strong beneath the ancient oak. "My lord," said their captain, a grizzled man whose left arm bore the twisted scars of old burns. "We feared you dead when we found the bloodied ground where your enemies left you." "Very nearly," Eric replied, his arm slipping around Thora's waist. "I owe my life to this woman's courage and skill in healing." The warrior's eyes moved to Thora with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. She was clearly not of their class. Her humble origins obvious, despite the royal cloak now adorning her shoulders. Yet something in Eric's tone warned against showing disrespect. "Men of my warband," Eric said formally, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "I present to you my wife, Queen Thora, wed this morning by sacred oath before the gods themselves." The announcement struck the gathered warriors like a physical blow. Several exchanged meaningful glances, clearly struggling to process this unexpected development. Their war chief had married a commoner, elevating a servant to the highest rank in their social order. "The cloak suits her," the captain said finally, and Thora heard genuine respect beneath his careful words. "She has the bearing of one born to command." Other warriors nodded their agreement, recognizing something in Thora's manner that transcended her humble birth. The wolf pelt cloak seemed to transform her, awakening a natural authority that had been suppressed by years of servitude. "Prepare for travel," Eric commanded his men. "We ride north within the hour. My father's court awaits news of my survival, and I have much to discuss with the king regarding the future of our realm." As the warriors moved to ready their horses and equipment, Eric turned back to Thora with an expression of mingled love and concern. "Are you ready for this? Once we leave this forest, there's no returning to the simple life you've known." Thora touched the sacred ring on her finger, feeling its weight like an anchor to this new reality. "I chose this path with open eyes. Whatever challenges await, we'll face them together." "Together," Eric agreed, sealing their compact with a kiss that tasted of pine needles and morning mist, of ancient oaths and impossible dreams made manifest. The servant girl was gone forever. In her place stood a queen, ready to reshape the northern world through the power of compassion, wedded to strength. 5 years had passed since the morning when compassion changed 2 destinies beneath an ancient oak. The great hall of Eric's northern stronghold buzzed with the gentle activity of evening, firelight dancing off polished shields and illuminated tapestries that told stories of battles won through wisdom rather than mere brutality. Thora, now Queen Thora, sat beside her husband's throne, her fingers absently turning the golden arm ring set that had become the symbol of their enduring bond. The matching rings caught the firelight, their surfaces engraved with intertwining patterns that spoke of 2 lives made one. She wore them always, a reminder of the choice that had transformed a servant girl into a queen beloved by her people. "The harvest reports are encouraging," Eric said, reviewing the scrolls that detailed their realm's prosperity. 3 years of peace have allowed the farms to recover from the old raiding cycles. Our people eat well, and the granaries are full for winter. The transformation in Eric himself was remarkable. The harsh lines of perpetual conflict had softened around his grey eyes, replaced by the calm assurance of a leader who ruled through respect rather than fear. His reputation for mercy had spread throughout the northern territories, attracting settlers and traders to lands that had once known only violence. "The emissaries from King Hrolf arrived this afternoon," Thora informed him, setting aside her own correspondence. "Your father requests your presence at the spring assembly. He wishes to discuss succession matters." Eric nodded thoughtfully. His relationship with his father had evolved slowly over the years, the old king gradually coming to appreciate the stability that his son's approach had brought to previously rebellious territories. The marriage that Harold had initially viewed as weakness had proven to be Eric's greatest strength. "Will you accompany me to court?" Eric asked, though he already knew her answer. "Always." Thora smiled, remembering their early conversations about facing whatever came together. "Though I suspect your father's advisors still find my presence unsettling. Let them be unsettled. You've proven that leadership comes from character rather than bloodline." Eric reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the golden rings that marked their bond. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of having the wisest counselor in the north by my side." The great doors opened to admit Lady Astrid, now a welcome guest rather than a distant neighbor. Age had silvered her hair completely, but her sharp eyes remained as keen as ever. She had become one of Thora's most trusted advisors, her practical wisdom invaluable in navigating the complexities of royal administration. "The delegation from Skallavik has arrived for the evening feast," she announced with satisfaction. "Your old friend Kari sends her regards, along with a proposal for expanding the healing schools." Thora's healing schools had become one of her greatest achievements as queen. Drawing on her mother's knowledge and her own experience, she had established centers throughout the realm where young women could learn the arts of medicine and midwifery. The program had dramatically reduced infant mortality and improved the general health of their people. "Kari always did have grand ambitions," Thora laughed, remembering her friend's enthusiasm for new projects. "What does she propose now?" "A network of trained healers who could travel to remote settlements, bringing medical knowledge to places that have never known proper care." Lady Astrid's tone carried approval. She's already identified candidates and secured funding from the merchant guilds. The evening feast that followed exemplified the changes that 5 years of compassionate rule had wrought. The hall filled with representatives from across the realm, farmers and craftsmen sitting beside former warriors, children playing safely around tables laden with abundant food. The atmosphere was one of genuine celebration rather than the uneasy displays of power that had marked gatherings under the old system. Eric rose to address the assembly, his voice carrying easily through the great space. Friends, we gather tonight to celebrate not just another successful harvest, but the transformation of our land from a place of constant conflict to one of prosperity and peace. The crowd responded with warm applause, their faces reflecting genuine affection for their rulers. This was not the fearful obedience that had greeted Eric's father, but the honest respect earned through years of just governance. 5 years ago, I learned that true strength comes not from the sword, but from the courage to show mercy when mercy is needed. Eric's eyes found Thora's across the hall. I learned this lesson from a woman who risked everything to save a stranger, who chose compassion over safety when faced with an impossible decision. Thora felt tears prick her eyes as she remembered that morning in the forest, the moment when she had decided to help a dying man despite the dangers. The choice had seemed so small at the time, yet it had rippled outward to change the fate of an entire realm. Tomorrow, we will send our answer to King Harold, Eric continued. We will tell him that our lands prosper because we have learned to lead with wisdom as well as strength, to value mercy alongside courage. As the feast continued late into the evening, Thora found herself thinking of her mother's pendant, now hanging in a place of honor beside their marriage bed. The simple silver circle had become a symbol of the humble origins from which great changes could spring. "Do you ever regret it?" Eric asked as they prepared for sleep, his voice soft in the candlelit privacy of their chamber. "What? Saving a dying stranger in the forest?" Thora smiled as she brushed out her hair, now crowned with the simple golden circlet that marked her royal status. "Never. Not for a single moment. Even knowing the dangers we've faced, the enemies who called our marriage an abomination, the challenges that still lie ahead? Especially because of those things." Thora turned to face her husband, seeing in his grey eyes the same gentleness that had first moved her to compassion. "Our love proved that kindness is stronger than convention, that mercy can indeed triumph over might." Eric gathered her into his arms, and for a moment they were simply a man and woman who had found their way to happiness through courage and choice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that a realm could thrive under leaders who valued wisdom alongside strength. But tonight, in the quiet of their shared sanctuary, they could rest in the knowledge that a single act of compassion had indeed changed the world, one kindness at a time.